igen, kedves kollégák, azt hiszem, hogy nem nagyon kell már várni senkire. Tegnapi napon megvolt az egyetemi előadás, gyakorlatilag már kialakult egy olyan struktúra, amit a mai napon követni fog menni. Nagyon röviden, Poncet professzornak, amit én is szeretnék köszönöm, körülben már megbeszéltük, tartani egy rövid bevezetőt, hogy megint csak ugye magyarok vagyunk, magyar nyelven, megígértem, hogy csupa jót fogok róla mondani. Nem érzi zavarva magát. Nagyon különleges a mostani alkalom, ugye ez egy rendes egyetemi elmálókrához, a történetkutatás módszertanához kapcsolódó élő prezentáció, amelyben alapvetően kutatás történettel és kutatási metódussal fogunk foglalkozni. Másfelől azonban a Katolikus Egyetemen MTA támogatással, most nem menjünk vele, hogy ez hogy változott, időben mi viseljük még a nevűben ezt a szép nevet működő Fraknói Kutatócsoportnak is egy különleges alkalma a mostani, hiszen szemeszterenként két alkalommal össze szoktunk jönni, hogy különösen is tanácskozunk a dolgainkról, eredményekről. Ez az alkalom most olyan szempontból így kivételes, hogy nem az operatív munkáról lesz jól a találkozás, hanem mi is próbálunk okulni abból, hogy a franciák mivel jött föltételek között a Vatikánban és Rómában a 19. század végétől itt és olyan tudtak működni, és mik a jelen problémáik, és mik a terveik, hogy a Fraknói Kutatócsoportnak is a neve is mutatja középpontjában a pápai gyűjteményekben, nagyobb részt a Vatikánban, ami az a történeti anyagnak a módszeres föltárása áll. Nyilván fogjuk lefeladni a franciáknak azért az intézményi háttér az mennyiben másabb, a mi célunk kifejezetre, hogy idővel valami hasonlókat kisebb formában is meg tudjuk valósítani, és nagyon megtisztelő számunkra, hogy ezen francia vatikáni kutatásoknak egyik mondhatni azt, nem is kis túlzással, hogy élő klasszikussal jött el hozzánk, aki a Római Francia Intézetnek örökös tagja, Olivier Poncet és 95-98 között 3 évig ösztöndíjasa volt, jelenleg pedig az École Nationale de Chartres-nak a professzora és néven igazgatója, ahol a 90-es években végzett is. Ez az intézmény régebben a Sorbonon volt elhelyezve, és azon önálló nagy francia intézetek, kutatóegyetemek közé tartozik, például a híres École Normale Supérieure, egy mintállál az ötös kollégium alakult jó 100 évvel ezelőtt ötös Lóráknak a kezdeményezésére, az ötös Józsefről ellenzett kollégium. Professzor Poncetnak az érdeklődése egyebek mellett levéltár és 16. századi francia intézménytörténeti érdeklődése mellett jól látjuk csak igen, látszik a legutóbbi konferencia részvételeiből is, hogy folyamatosan ugye, a pápaság történet francia szentszéki kapcsolatok állnak, és mindenkinek ajánlom ugye, az intézménynek, ami a Paris Science lehetős újabban létrehozott kutatóegyetemi hálózathoz tartozik, és ennek a csillagképpen, hogy a felfedező kutatásokhoz van köze, és az a bizonyos úr is, mert ugye bele van nevünk közéletben, ugye nálunk is már önfoglalni elképhez. Ugyanezt a folyamatos pápaság történeti érdeklődést mutatják az ő publikációi is, amelyek, és az intézménynek a publikációi is, amelyek ugyanezen a honlapon érdemes lesz majd tanulmányozni. Könyvtárak számára már korábban is megrendeltem ezekből a kiadványokból. Látszik, hogy már a kutatások és az oktatás során is már elműben használtuk az egyik igen nyilvánzás is a Római Francia Intézetnek a a kiadványát, azért betekintésre, főleg az egyetemi ifjúságnak, a kutatócsoport jelenleg is körbeadnám, de ugye 318. kötete, tehát ugye a vatikáni sorozatok ugye a 17-nél, tehát ugye ezt kívánok ugye majd utódainak, Viktor tanítványnak a tanítványainak, és most részén a tanítványainak, hogy ilyen köteteket magyar vonatkozásban is ilyen sorszámokat tudjanak kiadni, hiszen amíg van pápaság, sőt, hogyha megszűnik a pápaság még után is föltárolni, hogy még bőséggel marad, tehát munka, aki ezzel foglalkozik, lesz bőven, és azt hiszem, hogy a doktori monográfiát is körbeadnám, ami szintén egy diplomás, kezdeni, és hát persze a bestseller témák sem maradhatnak el, hiszen ugye, ha már pápaság és Itália és 17. század folyam Mazareni karrier, ez egy roppant érdekes nagy különbség számára is, és ez az egyik legutolsó munkája a Poncet professzornak, ami szintén fölvan egy Ákásnak indítva. Viszont very little presentation of your first and your scientific government, and please take up the lecture on the historiography and future of the French research. Thank you very much.
For a quarter of a century, I have been visiting the reading room of the archives of the Vatican, those of the Archivio Segreto, which became Archivio Apostolico since October, last October, it's very recent. Those of the archives of the section of extraordinary ecclesiastical affairs, of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, to speak only of those I have visited the most. I did so in order to better understand the pontifical institution and to better understand French history in the same time. I even had the great privilege of being, I believe, the first non-ecclesiastical French to be admitted to classify an archival collection in Archivio Vaticano. I returned then there again recently on the occasion of the writing of a book about a Roman and French cardinal at the same time, Giulio Mazarini, that you have seen the book, who is well known among the children of the world, even in Hungary, I presume, not because of historians, but by the grace of the novelist Alexandre Dumas. Every time I have the immense privilege of returning to sit in one of the reading rooms, I am struck by the importance of the heritage that surrounds me. Not only the archival heritage that I come to collect to write history, but also the legacy of my predecessors, archivists or researchers, who also made the sources I am consulting. At the invitation of my colleague and friend Péter Pázmány, who gives me the great pleasure to be here among you in this beautiful town of Budapest, I would like to return with you to what was the saga of the encounter of a country, France, with archives that are unique in the world and that are made to understand the world history. The story I am going to tell you is not unique. We can do the same for other countries, and I think that in the context of this group of researchers, that bears the name of the well-known and illustrious Vilmos Fraknói, I don't need to emphasize this obvious finding. The history is certainly that of a repository of archives to none other-like, but it also says much, and perhaps even more, of what French historiography was for 2 centuries, from its relationship to the source of archives, its links with the religious and papal dimension of its destiny, its capacity to dialogue or not with other national historiographies. The historian travels his sources too. For the French, the Vatican archives have domestic, even national perfume. Long before the Vatican archives were officially opened for research under Leo XIII in 1881, they were the subject of consultations and appropriations by the French during their long history. We now know, thanks to Christine Maria Roffinger, who edited the registers of the Vatican Library on this subject, especially, that the archives of the popes, like those of our somewhere in Europe, were opened very punctually to satisfy the curiosity of some scholars. In France, King Louis XV had set up a kind of documentation center, quickly called Cabinet des Chartes, intended to gather titles exhibiting the work of the monarchy since the Middle Ages. Scholars, French scholars, were sent to copy documents not only in the French archives, but also in foreign archives, including those of the Pope. Between 1776 and 86, Gabriel de la Porte du Teil, protected by the Cardinal de Berny, brought back thousands of copies of acts drawn from the registers of bulls of the 13th century first, then of the 14th century. This is the most important copies and collect of papal documents carried out on the spot until the official opening of the pontificate of Leo XIII. But at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, the French did more than simply copy acts. At the end of the 18th century, most of the archives of the Papacy of Avignon were still in Avignon, in the palace of the popes. After a third occupation of the city by the troops of the King of France between 1768 and 74, the Pope decided to repatriate them to Rome in 1783 at the initiative of the great archivist Giuseppe Garnacchi. Within a few years, these precious medieval documents would have become property of the French state in 1792, when the papal territories in France were annexed and transformed into a department. A few years later, the seizure was effective and was not limited to the medieval archives of the papacy. In 1810, Napoleon I, after having annexed the city of Rome to make it the capital of the French department of the Tiber, next of Rome, ordered to move a large part of the ancient archives of the papacy to Paris, where he was centralizing the archives of the main executive powers of the territories which were now part of the French Empire. So, for example, Madrid, Vienna, and also. The French army was mobilized for this transfer of tons of documents, with hundreds of boxes and wagons crossing the rivers and mountains of Italy and France. Once they arrived in France, some of these archives were copied. The custodian of the archives of the Empire, Donou, took the opportunity to write an historical essay sur le pouvoir temporel des papes, an essay on the temporal power of the popes, in which he spoke, among other things, about the black episodes of the history of the papacy, like the Templars or the Inquisition. And he began the edition of correspondences of nuncios, of bulls, etc., intended to emphasize the interference of the popes in the life of France. The military difficulties of the end of the empire made it impossible to classify what had been sent from Rome. In 1815, at the fall of Napoleon, the archives were returned to the Pope, who decided not to repatriate everything, but to send part of it by the weight of the paper to pay the return of the rest. As a result of this choice, many judicial and administrative documents were lost, including many Inquisition files, which were not lost for everyone. For example, wrecks were found in Trinity College in Dublin, the National Archives in Paris, also kept a few dozen registers and boxes forgotten by the movers of the time. Then, subsequently, in the 19th century, the French no longer had access to the Vatican archives, with the exception of the enterprise of the prefect, Augustin Taina, who published the continuation of the Annals of Baronius with the help of a young student of the École des Chartes, Henri de l'Épinois. In 1870, it was less the capture of Rome by Victor Emmanuel's troops than the defeat of France against the Germany that caused a considerable change in the access of French to the archival resources of the Vatican. In response to the challenge of German science, France decided, among other things, to create in 1873 a school on the model of the French school in Athens, of which it was first an appendix. This time, however, the school was not only archaeological, but also historical. That is to say that manuscripts, libraries, and archives were also especially its main targets. The first searches in the archive of the popes by French members were made in the papers saved by the Italians and preserved at the Archivio di Stato in Rome, among the immense resources of the Apostolic Chamber. In this way, Eugène Muntz drew very large volumes devoted to the history of art in the 15th century. But it was only a starter intended to make greater appetite of the French School of Rome. The new director, appointed in 1875, Auguste Geffroy, was a modernist historian, specializing particularly in the 18th century. He notes at his arrival that Italy, unlike Greece, was relatively close to the national archaeological states, and that the unpublished sources would be easier to pick up from the manuscripts than from the Italian soil. In addition, his personal interest, led him to encourage medieval and modern studies. He then increased contacts through the French embassy with the papal authorities. In 1877, Geffroy finally obtained, in a very unofficial way, that a young Frenchman, Élie Berger, be allowed to take copies of the bulls of the Register of the Popes of the 13th century. Berger had been trained at the École des Chartes, and despite the fact that he was a Protestant, and even the son of a pastor, he spent 3 years copying in a certain secret the registers which were brought to him in a small room of the Vatican library. This was probably a kind of test, a bench of experimentation intended to prepare an upcoming opening. This method of delayed opening was carried forward a century later, when preparations were made for the opening in 1998 of the Index and Inquisition archives, on which dozens of historians had been working for some years in a big secret. In fact, the official opening of the Vatican archives took place in 1880-81. The essential of the good guidelines and of the institutions that participate in the publishing and study enterprises linked to the archive of the Holy See appeared during the first decade which followed the opening of the archives, wished by Leo XIII. If the French school was already present even before 1880, it was soon joined by many workers from all over Europe, some of whom embodied the hopes of an entire population, as Vilmos Fraknói exhibited it in 1882 in an impressive program of work, which he carried out in an equally impressive manner. At first, at a time when methodological history was based its demonstration on the establishment of facts, the edition of text seems the best and the fastest way to offer researchers from the various countries the opportunity to benefit from the archive of the Pope that were so long inaccessible. 2 types of sources, depending on the period under consideration, that initially attracted researchers. In the eyes of the medievalists, nothing was more worthy of consideration than the registers of letters of the popes, preserved in the series of Registri Vaticani, Registri Abelianenses, and Registri Lateranenses. The preference of modern historians, on the other hand, went to the archive of the Secretariat of State and especially of the correspondences of nunciators. Basically, these two chronological paths drew two epistemological and methodological attitudes before the manner of the papal archives: to study the papacy for itself and to seek from its sources the lessons useful to the writing of national history. The French first tried to combine the two approaches. As regards the publication of the registers of the popes of the 13th century, the French School of Rome took advantage of its precedents and of the permanent arrival of new members in Rome to occupy an almost hegemonic position. It soon took over, de facto, the publishing of the letters of the most of the sovereign pontiff of the 13th century. Each new member, appointed for only 2 years as a general rule, engaged an edition of a new pontificate without waiting for the previous one to be completed. There was no overall plan or common publishing principle guiding the work of the editors, who adapted the mixed method of analysis and integral editing that Berger had followed for Innocent IV according to their needs. If the French editions didn't make a priori any selection and delivered all the documentary material corresponding to a pontificate, French, Hungarian, German and Spanish and also, they gave first the main part to the documents of interest to France. The very choice of pontificates attested to the concern to enlighten national history through the papal registers. Innocent I and Saint Louis, Boniface VIII and Philippe the Fair, for example, whose kingdom were the subject of an extensive summary as an introduction to the publication of documents. First, France could combine both the concern to understand the papacy of that time and at the same time to elaborate a useful complement to national history. But the progress was slow. 15 years after the first recounts of Élie Berger, only the registers of Honorius I and Nicolas I were completely published. Moreover, France put all these forces into publishing medieval sources and completely abandoned the modern archives of nunciators in particular. This was a sort of an original sin that had struggled the French erudition, and it took a long time to recover from it, even though the search for sources previously unpublished in the Vatican knew a sort of golden age at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Under the direction of Louis Duchesne, the French School of Rome intensified its program of publication of the letters of the popes by entrusting to each member who wished it on his arrival at a new pontificate. It first penetrates decisively into the 13th century of Avignon, so close to the history of France. The growing mass of documents to be edited and their typological evolution as the registers of the 14th century are stripped necessitated major changes in editorial strategies. The first series of registers and letters of the popes, which embraces the pontificates up to and including Benedict XI, 1304, inherited the original choices of Berger and respects the internal order of registers. The table restores the strict chronological orders of the order of acts. The second series, for the 14th century, distinguishes secret and curial letters from common letters. The first are entrusted, like the letters of the 13th century, to members of the school. However, to avoid the publication reaching excessive proportions and taking note of the Prussian projects, the French school resolved to multiply the analysis and to confine itself to pieces that interest France. First, sacrificing to the patriotic aims present since the 80s of the 19th century, and shared by all the other institutes established in Rome. Nationalism and historical science then forged strong alliances. For the common letters, on the other hand, the very Republican school of Rome called by reinforcement of the clergy of Saint-Louis des Français, in particular Guillaume Mola, a tireless publisher of Pope's common letters for more than half a century. Enthusiasm was in order. Duchesne, with the equivalent of Vilmos Fraknói, after some preliminary calculations, didn't hesitate to affirm in 1895, I quote, "There is reason to believe that with 3 members of the school employed for 5 or 6 years, we could easily reach the end of the 14th century." 10 years later, despite the thousands of pages published, it was necessary to recognize the impracticability in the short term of this undertaking, which was handicapped both by the excessive number of open work sites and by the administrative and academic tasks which occupied most of the publishers after their return from Rome. The French school of Rome was too absurd in the registers of the popes of the 13th and 14th century to come into the following period. It made no attempt to imitate the Germans, who had launched the Repertorium Germanicum, even though French realities represented a large proportion, about a third, of the acts concerned by the sources of this period. Only a priest of Saint-Louis des Français, Joseph Le Cellier, engaged in an analysis which had remained unpublished for more than a century of the registers of supplication of the second half of the 15th century, considered too little French-friendly in Rome to interest French scholarship. Then the French institution in Rome didn't devote any effort to the sources after the Reformation, in particular the correspondences of the nuncios, whose importance the Germans had established for their national history. The initiative came from a private association, the Archives religieuses de la France, directed by the historian of the Reformation, Pierre Albert de la Tour. It proposed, among other purposes, to carry out a selective edition of the correspondences of nuncios in France in the 16th century, likely to shed light on the origins of the Reformation and the wars of religion. Only 3 volumes appeared before 1914, which were poor alongside the fruits of the German language erudition. Finally, the research devoted to the French Revolution and to the Empire, a long period of distrust and break with the Holy See, was surrounded with a strong ideological weight, not to mention the difficulties related to the state of the sources. It was first necessary to wait until the end of the pontificate of Leo XIII before being found during an excavation carried out in the floor of the Vatican gardens, the documents that today form the emigrati collection of the Secretary di Stato, and which had been buried there in 1809 at the time of the occupation of Rome by Napoleon's troops. However, the Revolution period was of interest, and correspondence publications were published in the 1890s and in the 19th, which constituted for a century the essential of what French historians have used of the record of the Vatican concerning this historical era. Beyond the pontificate of Pius VI, and although the opening of the archive extended until the year 1815, begins what is still only a no man's land editorial. Only a few isolated publications appear, such as the account of the transfer of the mortal remains of Pius VI to Rome in 1802, or the letters of Napoleon. The impact of the First World War on the small world that frequented the papal archives was significant. Certainly, publications here and there prepared before the war maintained the illusion of continuity beyond the thunder of the cannons. However, The pace of general publication of the editions was seriously halted, and the French pontifical letters were limited to 2 papers published in 1916 and 17. Some texts about to be published on the eve of the war remained for a time in the boxes, when they themselves were not victims of the military operations. For example, Gustave Constant, editor of the legation of Cardinal Morone to the Emperor, nearly lost his work. The printing game was ready at the printer Desclée in Lille when the German soldiers seized the city and decomposed the book to save the characters. But other texts were definitely lost. Ready also at the time of the outbreak of the hostilities, the manuscript of the second volume of the Annunciators of France of Paul I, whose author had died in the meantime, didn't survive the war, in which it would have been burned. The economic conditions of the immediate post-war period affected all institutes without distinction. The high cost of living also affects the printing costs, which threaten the continuation of the expensive publications programs, especially in the French school. Émile Mann, who was director of the French school in Rome since 1922, declared, "The implacable power of money threatens to triumph over the spirits." With the exception of Guillaume Molin, who provided his common letters for John the 22nd, no papal letters appeared between 1920 and 29, which aroused Paul Fournier's excitement. I quote, "The work undertaken half a century ago is far from complete. It makes us think of this Italian city, whose great families once wanted to build palaces. The construction of some of them was completed. Many others remain unfinished and are now considered ruins. I don't need to say that this state of affairs provokes, especially abroad, unflattering reflections on our national self-esteem." The second volume of the Annunciature of Clement VII by Joseph Fréquin appeared posthumously in 1927 in general indifference after the drawing of his author in the Tiber. Everyone expected much from international collaboration, which not only allows to unite the material forces, but also to hope for a gathering of scientists from all over the world. In the context of the rise of nationalism and totalitarianism, it is a failure at the very moment when several half-centenaries were celebrated, that of the opening of the archives as that of the first institutes founded in Rome. While everyone wants to draw up a laudatory account of the work undertaken, young researchers like Michel François, that he will be further director of the École des Chartes, expressed their bitterness at the delay that taken by his institution in the publication of the registers of the popes. I quote, The outbreak of the Second World War didn't slow anything down, since everything was more or less at a standstill. The French school, administratively withdrawn in Lyon since 1940, after the sequestration of the Palazzo Farnese by the Italian authorities, signaled itself by a complete absence of publications during the whole war. In many respects, the Second World War had a far greater impact on the countries concerned than the first. But recovery in the general context of European reconstruction for the West was faster than in the 20s. It was accompanied by an euphoric editorial movement unseen since 1914. The French school at first found it difficult to revive the editions and above all struggled to convince the young historians who joined it to continue their efforts of their elders. First, Robert-Henri Gautier, barely out of the École des Chartes after having been at the liberation of the France the secretary of the prefect of the Center of France, accepted badly to immerse himself in Benedictine work at his arrival in Rome and asked to plough other sources for another history. He says, "I was one of the few privileged and perhaps the first Chartists whose efforts were successful in escaping what we considered then to be a core, that of preparing the papal regests. Coming to Italy to study the Mediterranean trade trends of the Middle Ages and having no vocation for religious history, I considered, as my comrades, that the traditional regests in Latin of the acts of the papal chancellery were an obsolete obligation." In spite of these real reserves, which expressed that French historiography had evolved faster than the work programs in Rome, the 20 years that separates the recovery from afterward of an era where the computer element constitutes the great novelty, presents many similarities with the gold age of before 1940. The years 1955 to 75 saw in fact the conjunction of the same elements which had designated the pontificates of Leo XIII and Pius X as a flagship period for the publication of pontifical sources. Of all the sectors of the publishing of pontifical sources, the publications related to the medieval period were first of all the least innovative in terms of methodology. While many factors contributed to the revival of printed production history, the way of tradition and collection that had been open for many decades and were awaiting completion. The economic factor, in particular, finally made it possible to avoid crucial choices and vigorously revive publications. In many respects, the French school's publications of the letters of the Pope went for a period, if not an heroic one, as the year 1910, were at least an impressive one on paper by the number of printed pages. In almost 5 years, a thoughtful policy of printing an index made it possible to close in 1960, only in 1960, the edition of the registers of the 13th century. This great completion, as Robert Faftier called it in 1960, was also accompanied by a real effort to complete in a similar way the pontificates of the 14th century. Common letters of Urban V, sacred letters of Innocent VI, or the cover of the sacred letters of John XXII, interrupted before the First World War. Under the impetus of the Dominican Maria Saint Laurent, the edition of the letters of the popes renewed the great edition of the late 19th century. A considerable number of papers first appeared in a relatively continuous stream. In addition, this period of pomp encouraged to go off the old ways in an attempt to create new areas for publishing, such, for example, as the correspondence of the papal legates in the 14th century by Jean Bénisson and Guillaume Molin. It was during these exceptional years that the collection of the Acta Nunciatura Gallicae was born. It is the result of a collaboration between the French School of Rome and the Gregorian University, which divided the publishers roughly equally. The first volume, prepared by Jean Lestautois, at the instigation of the former nuncio in France, Angelo Roncalli, who became Pope John 23 in 1958, appeared in 1961. He devoted an important part to the analysis, retaining for the complete edition only the fields of importance. In other words, what the nuncio holds first hand, hearings, interviews, and also. This editorial option has been corrected in subsequent volumes, where publishers extended the principle of full quotation, in particular to passages of the nuncio echoes rumors circulating in the court, testimonies of history that may have as much importance as new data as safe. This methodological flexibility makes it possible to approach scenes hitherto infrequent by publishers, such as the second half of the 17th century, with the voluminous correspondence of Angelo Ranuzzi, published by Bruno Neveu in 1973. This 20-year period was brilliant for the edition of the Nunciatures of France. It was also so for the place which is devoted by the other countries to the documents of other series or of other periods, in particular the 19th century. For example, pastoral visits of the archives of the Congregation of Propaganda. But France shone there by its absence. The argument of the concentration of resources on traditional programs played a role, of course. But there was also the difficulty that some historians had in considering that France belongs fully to the territories that propaganda had to deal with. Finally, and this criterion may have played even more strongly. The religious crisis in France, made up of de-Christianization and distance from the Curia and the Holy See, considered the heavy crisis of worker priests in 1953, has diverted or deterred historians who specialize in the religious field from emphasizing the papal dimension of the field. At first, France didn't take enough advantage of the extension of the chronological boundaries of access to the sources. In particular, the pontificate of Pius IX from 1946 to 78, opened by the Pope Paul VI in 1967. This shift in the documentary frontier has ultimately a limited impact on text editions and studies in general, particularly among French historians. The early 1970s provided an opportunity to pause publishing and reflect on the work that had been done for nearly a century. This methodological reflection affects both the publishers of medieval documents, especially at the Third International Diplomatic Congress held in Rome in 1971, and those who were devoting their efforts to the publications of Nunciatures. In particular, I must quote the meeting of 1971, the same year, at the German Institute to Rome. While no one questioned the value of publishing edition of sources, the dominant impression is that an historiographic era was over. The medievalists, especially French, are the first to place their hopes then in the development of the computerized means to overcome the serial masses of the papal acts contained in the great series of medieval registers. The medievalists, accustomed for a long time to manipulating the papal archives, will try, the first and for a long time the only, use the new possibilities offered by informatics to process large series of registers, which researchers are trying to grasp by all means. As early as the late 60s, following the lexicologists, historians became aware of the value of automated processing of their documentation. The great series of papal registers seem to lend themselves quite naturally to the use of computers. I quote, "A large part of the papal acts, grouped together in various sets of registers, are documents whose form and substance are not very diversified, so that they could be qualified as serials. It is an epithet that would be particularly appropriate for the registries of supplications in which clerics and laymen, in a rigorous form established by the rules of the pontifical chancery, presented their request to the Pope." In 1975, during the round table organized by the French school in Rome, there was the consecration of informatic among the publishers of pontifical sources. It will take many years to complete, experimenting after experimenting, until it leads to innovative databases and publications. The School of Rome immediately encouraged the creation of a computer database of more than 20,000 Urban V petitions, which was completed in 1990 Above all, it took advantage of new technologies to give our secular efforts a navigational tool that the pioneers of the 1880s would not have thought of. From 1999 and in a little over 10 years, the purpose of the Ut per Litteras database project, in conjunction with the publisher of records, was ultimately to gather 250,000 papal documents from the 13th and 14th centuries, from Honorius III to Gregory XI. The French School of Rome doesn't forget, however, to continue on a more traditional and often slowed down the working sites that have sometimes been open for a long time. The Common Letters of Urban V, begun in 1954, was completed in 1989, and the old project of the edition of the Common Letters of Gregory XI was completed. Finally, it was decided at the beginning of the 21st century to relaunch the publication of the secret and curial letters of Innocent VI, interrupted after 1976. On the road to computer science, success is celebrated, but we must also honestly talk about failures or abandonments. A project led by the one speaking to you today was designed in 1998 to electronically index the briefs and the bulks sent by the Secretary of the Briefs, per via secretam or per camera, without selections of places or people. The first analysis covered the period 1565 to 90. Unfortunately, the informatical logistics did not make it possible to give substance to this ambition, which in a certain way removed the views of the pioneers of the Third Republic. At the same time, the other part of the traditional studies devoted to by the French researchers to the papal archives, the apostolic nunciatures, experienced a slowdown and even from the editorial point of view, a stop. The last volume of the Acta Nunciaturae Gallicae was published in 2002 by Bertrand Hahn. The balance sheet to date is a fairly complete coverage of the first half of the 16th century, only 20 years for the second half and 10 years for each of the next 2 half centuries, which is very poor, in fact. The problem here is the difficulty of finding motivated publishers, both at the Gregorian University, whose students are less able or less willing to work on the literature of France, while at the École des Chartes it is not easy to engage in this type of exercise. While many delays are also related to hesitations on the form to be given in an electronic environment, it should be noted the existence of various projects concerning nunciatures and legations of Hippolyte d'Este, Giovan Francesco Morosini, and Alessandro de' Medici for the 16th century, but the most advanced project concerns the Nunciature Grimaldi for the years 1641-44. There is a note, I will say. As we have seen, we must consider both the demand of historians and the supply of conservation institutions. Under the pontificate of John Paul II, the policy of extending the chronological scope of funds available for research was confirmed twice. Shortly after his election in 1979, the Pope opened the pontificate of Leo XIII, 1878 to 93, for consultation. In 1985, he extended the measure by providing access to documents produced during pontificates of Pius X and Benedict XV, so to 1922. This last decision contains in itself an extremely interesting evolution, since it applies to all the papal archives and not only the repositories visited then by the historians that were the Archivio Vaticano and the archives of the Congregation of the Propaganda. Now considered as a whole, the archival heritage of the Holy See is gaining publicity as well as homogeneity. Then the collections kept getting better and better now. It must be repeated, until 1943, during the Second World War, there were no guides to orientate themselves in the Vatican archives. The French had a big article from Michel François in the 1930s, but that was all. The publication of the guide, written in Italian by Lajos Pastor in 1970, was a revelation for many researchers who didn't imagine the wealth of fonts for the most recent and least frequently stripped by researchers. I could not mention here in Budapest this other giant of Hungarian scholarship in the Vatican archives, which has done a lot to draw the attention of research of all countries on unknown funds by taking the pretext of a guide of sources of Latin America placed under the auspices of UNESCO and the International Council of Archives. This guide is still invaluable, despite the publication only in 1999 of the first French-language guide initiated by Canadian researchers. The classification of the more recent funds and the publication of the related research instruments is also a proactive way of inviting to explore new areas, to ask new questions to original documentation, as I was able to do by classifying and inventorying the archive of the Nunciature of Paris for the period 1807 to 1904. The opening of the new chronological tranches by bringing them closer together has finally provoked for the 19th and 20th century a strong involvement of French historians, less in terms of publishing sources than in synthesis capable of embracing all steps of the pontifical institution. Prosopography of the Curia of the first 19th century, Philippe Boutry. History of the Curial institutions in the 19th century, François Jacobiac. International policy of the papacy after 1870, Jean-Marc Tichy. Or Papacy and World War I, Francis Latour, to name but a few works that have directly benefited from these openings of funds. If the French became aware of the archives of the congregations later than others, they drew high-quality materials for their new studies. The archives of propaganda in particular have become for some 30 years a major place of work, which has made it possible to highlight both the importance of the congregation for the Catholic reconquest in the modern era, but also its role in the missions of overseas territories subject to French political domination, such as the West Indies or Africa. In the same way, while France has never known the modern Inquisition, or perhaps because of it, the collections of the Index and Inquisition congregations were regularly visited by French researchers who found multiple elements to understand what was the control of theological or literary publications in a country whose language was familiar to the prelates of the congregation. Research in France and at the French school in Rome has now entered the era of programs limited in time and limited to well-identified problems. In a way, this new way of doing things, or research, if it is contrary to pluridecennial ambitions, is rather well adapted to take into account the new archival opportunities that are offered to the historians and that continue to multiply in recent years. The opening in 2006 of the archives of the pontificate of Pius XI didn't give rise to heavy editorial projects, as was the case almost immediately at the German Institute. This is partly due to the fact that the French School of Rome had already published, even before the archives were available, 2 in-depth studies of this pontificate, according to a pattern that had been partly that of the previous pontificates in the 20th century. But it was considered interesting to reflect on the effects of the introduction of historical research on the market of these masses of unpublished documents through two meetings in 2010 and 11, which made it possible to draw up an inventory of the research on this period. From now on, French research has decided to anticipate access to new documentary fronts in order to draw up historical reviews and research perspectives. The announcement by Pope Francis I on 4th March 2019 of the opening in January 2020 of the documents of the pontificate of Pius XII will give rise to a series of meetings in France between October of this year to January, to imagine what the ways might be the most useful to explore on this occasion, while taking into account the progress made in the funds available since the beginning of this century. Moreover, the French School of Rome regularly federates projects whose implementation implies an important, if not fundamental, recourse to pontifical sources, as for example, the Social and Prosopographic History project dedicated to the cardinals and cardinalates from 1775 to 1978, or the ongoing program dedicated to spiritual censorship and government in the long time of the Christian tradition. Another international project, this one, should involve French, German and Italian researchers on the theme of congregations as a system of government from the 16th to the 20th century, with a strong emphasis on the pontifical case. We see it after a few decades of relative eclipse and without being more necessarily linked to the editorial programs imagined in other times and in other places. French research has fully reintegrated the papacy into the landscape of its historical studies. It is legitimate to ask him to open even bigger windows. It is always difficult to engage in any kind of futurology or to sketch out ways of working that one will not take oneself, or at least alone. On the other hand, it is possible to identify approaches and sources which deserve the attention of French researchers because they are probably well prepared to borrow them, and then because the history of France will benefit greatly. Social history is one of the successes and characteristic features of 20th century French historiography. École des Annales, history of institutions or diplomatic policy, archival conceptions in the French style have come in to highlight this approach of the actors of history. It can be broken down according to several fields of work: historical demography, prosopography, wealth levels, strategies of social ascension, sociology of institutions, etc. It may also favor the graphical, individual or group analysis based on serial exploitation. Throughout the old regime, and according to the greater or lesser extension of the Catholic world between the 15th and 19th centuries, made of European retraction and continental expansion, France represents between 10 and 13% of the total number of acts issued by the major courier organizations, such as the Pontifical Chancellery, the various secretaries, the Date Office, the Penitentiary, or the Apostolic Chamber. The paradox is that countries that are less well represented, or even less well represented, have sometimes begun this identification work, starting with the example given by Péter Pázmány and his students in their beautiful volume of 2014 dedicated to the sources of Hungary in the archives of the Apostolic Chamber. France, in a way, is inhibited by the mass that would be necessary to draw thousands of registers available. When we see the slow progress of the Repertorium Germanicum, whose target represents only 12 to 18% of acts, and much less with the appearance of the Reformation, we understand that the challenge is enormous for French research. But it would probably be possible to designate a mass of documentaries that are more profitable or deserve special attention. The partial opening of the archives of the penitentiary, for example, is a remarkable opportunity for France, since this type of source is well suited to the strengths of the French historiographic school, whether it is historical demography or social history in the broad sense. French historians, strengthened by their long practice of notarial archives in France itself, should then focus on all papal sources, especially those which are no longer under the responsibility of the Pope. It is desirable to break the magic ring that keeps researchers out of the economic, social, or judicial sources preserved for the 15th to the 19th century at the Archivio di Stato di Rome. For the past century and a half, historians have written in some way three stories of the papacy, according to the periods they choose and the deposits they frequent. The first is a medieval and mixes all dimensions, since almost the archives of this time are kept in the Vatican. The second, always based on the sources of the Vatican, favors in fact the political, diplomatic and ecclesiological dimensions of the papacy. While the third, which is rather the work of Italian historians and international art historians, emphasizes the economic and social management of the city of Rome and of the papal states and the history of the international community that lives and works in Rome. However, they are the same cardinals, the same curialists, the same scudi, the same symbols, the same rules that circulate between one period and another, between one set of archives and another. It is also a question of thinking of the papacy as a less vertical than circular mechanism of reintegrating administrative dimensions, disciplinary or ecclesiological in diplomatic study, and conversely consider that there is a coherent and a conscious policy of dispensation of graces and indulgences by the Pope, which exceeds the mechanical movement of the security organs of the city of Rome. The abusive divisions of research work in Rome and the Vatican have been settled down over the centuries and the openings of funds. They have sometimes led to the formations of groups of historians who are sometimes too separated from each other. To bring them together, to think of the papacy and its relationship to the world as a whole, is, in my opinion, one of the great challenges of papal historiography for decades to come. France has its place there, but certainly not alone, and at the age of European cooperation, it will be a lot of sense. My conclusion, the first decade after the opening of the Vatican archives in the 19th century was comparable to an extremely feverish gold rush that quickly took on the face of long-term editorial programs assumed by the national institutes and their large collections. Currently, the combination of that digital technical possibilities, new funds open to research, as well as the rapid evolution of the new fields of the historian leads to a burst of initiatives and an acceleration of project changes. Of course, the institutes have never monitored all the sources studied, all the source studies related to the archives of the Holy See. What was true yesterday is even more true today. The explanation of the New Vatican Gold Rush, of which the years 1990 and 2020s are the privileged witness, has saved all countries, France and of course, but also the countries of Eastern Europe, which have reconnected with a research history in the Vatican, which the Western countries have only the chance not to see it abruptly interrupted. It may reflect a rare return to the sources, notable around the world where historians are once again questioning the foundations of their practices. Thank you very much.
Splendid lecture. Now is the session of questions and remarks.
researchers works this area? Vatican and France.
It's difficult to answer, but I would say from Middle Ages to contemporary era, perhaps 30 or 40 researchers are really working as I do. So I don't study Vatican sources all the day and all the year, but it's one of my activities. I can say that 30 or 40 researchers in France are in the same case as I am. That's right, I think. Young and less young.
And which university the main place?
I would say Paris. There are many universities in Paris. Lyon, because Lyon is a very Catholic city, very interested in researching, perhaps in contemporary era. It's the main group of researchers is in Lyon. There are 2 or 3 researchers in Brittany that they are very active on the pontificates of Pius XI and Pius XII. Yes, that's all. 1 or 2 researchers in Marseille or Lille, but the Greek groups are in Paris, Lyon, and Brittany, perhaps. Perhaps it's more well represented in all the France for the medieval, because medieval history is less identified as a pontifical study. Papacy is considered as a power, and only a power as so comparable to royal power, prince's power. In the period of early modern period and modern period, papacy is a special power. It's considered as so.
Conference is in Rome. How many stipendiates has per year?
How many members in the
Number of stipendiates who are working effectively in the Roman archives.
today?
Yes, in Rome.
In the member in the French school in Rome, I think 2 or 3 members are really very actively working in the papal archives.
And
Not to write a papal history or religious history, but to search links to the colonies and to understand the transformation of the recent world.
And then they have 2 or 3 years to do research in Rome. You have had 2 or 3 years to do research.
I was 5 years in Rome.
5?
Yes. It takes time. This one and the white one, the bibliography and the introduction. I wrote it in Rome.
And nowadays, usually, how many years has a stipendium?
Normally it's 3 years. For a young researcher, it's 3 years, yes.
3 years.
Yes, right, yes. And the age of the members is always grows always. They are 30 when they arrive in Rome. They are almost doctorate, so they have time.
Yes. And we are now also a member of the École Française. Well, what does it mean? Title, or will you have meetings ordinarily in Rome, in Paris, or what?
To be a member in the French school is to have time and money. It's a very privileged situation. You have time to make research, so that after the school you have more chance to be integrated in the university. No, it's a very privileged situation. And as you have seen, it's an historical situation. Why Rome and not London or Berlin, or Shanghai or Washington? That's the heritage of the France of the Third Republic, where the heritage, the historical heritage, was Mediterranean and classical. So, as you have seen, the very special situation of Rome, because it was not possible to make archaeological excavations like in Greece, diverted the forces, the scientific forces, to the archives. And the opening of the Vatican archive was a chance. And also provoked by France, but it was a chance so that France invested a lot on these archives. And while the pontifical archives are well made for all the historical problems, they are still interesting for researchers that are not occupied by religious purposes. It's possible to work on social, on migrations, on economical problems. These archives are very interesting for all the questions an historian can have.
The type of subject on which you are working or you work presently in the Vatican archives or Vatican Apostolic archives or around now?
Okay, I must say that today I prefer working in the Archivista di Roma on these problems I've said at the end of my intervention. So the social formation of the Curia. How did this organic center works and lives in the early modern era? I find it very interesting. I worked, before to go to Rome, I worked in France in the notarial archives. And I would make the same with the Roman archives, so the notarial archives. It's very interesting to see the overface of the papacy and of the cardinal. I'm very interested in how the papacy could make money. That's also that's a way to manage his religious and magisterial ambitions. So transformation of fiscal policy into religious policy. We can't understand the growth of Rome, of the missions, without taking into consideration all this black and not so easy work made by the chamber, by the apostolic chamber, to buying offices and creating taxes, and also it's very interesting to note, for example, that the Pope, like Sixtus V, was the best Pope for these taxes and the best Pope for Rome, for the reform of the cardinals, and also I think it's a pontificate, but it's very exemplary of what is the modern papacy. For the 19th and 20th century papacy, I'm not a specialist, but I would like to know more about this other front of the war, the papacy. So that's my answer. But the pontifical archives are very interesting too. The conversations, I think. It will be very interesting, for example, today to edit the correspondence of the nunciatures, not only with the Secretary of State, but the correspondence between the nuncios and the singular congregations, the Inquisition, the propaganda, because there was a very strong dialogue with this congregation. That gives another image of the nuncios on the place. He was very interested in this, and this correspondence was not viewed by the Secretary of State. merci. Bravo. We are alone.
Y aurait-il quelques relations scientifiques entre des écoles annales et les chercheurs en Rome?
Oui. Il ne faut pas imaginer l'école française de Rome comme une institution étanche. L'historiographie qui se développe en France finit par arriver à Rome. Un très bon exemple, dans les années 1950, in the 50s, Jean Delumeau, who is well known also for his religious chapters and books, a travaillé sur l'histoire économique et sociale de Rome. Et il était dirigé par Fernand Braudel. Donc c'est un symbole du fait que l'historiographie des annales a aussi pénétré le champ romain. Autre exemple, l'histoire des mentalités, l'histoire sérielle a été par exemple incarnée par Jacques Chiffolo, qui a travaillé sur les testaments et sur la comptabilité de l'au-delà. Et il est tout à fait dans cette ambiance de la nouvelle histoire religieuse et de la nouvelle histoire sociale des mentalités dans les années 1970. Et il le fait à Rome aussi. Donc il y a vraiment, si vous voulez, l'école française de Rome, elle est comme une éponge. Elle aspire ce qui est... Alors ça pose des problèmes quand ça arrive trop tôt. C'est ce que j'ai dit à propos de Robert-Henri Bautier au sortir de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Mais après, on a considéré que c'était même plutôt une force. Et aujourd'hui, c'est un petit peu l'inverse. C'est-à-dire qu'aujourd'hui, pour faire de l'histoire religieuse, ou pour travailler sur les archives du Vatican, à l'école de Rome, il faut non pas dissimuler, mais il faut inventer une présentation qui permet d'inclure ces questionnements ou ces sources dans des problématiques qui sont celles de l'histoire mainstream. Je qualifierais ça comme ça. Et c'est toujours possible. C'est toujours possible. Vous voyez, il y a des programmes qui se font, mais c'est vrai que c'est plus l'école qui donne le ton, c'est plutôt l'école qui est à l'écoute de ce qui se passe en France. Ça change. Mais c'est pas un drame, je pense que, comme je le disais, les archives du pape, quelles que soient les archives du Vatican, des congrégations, sont des archives exceptionnelles. Il est beaucoup question, je pense en Hongrie aussi, d'histoire globale, d'histoire partagée. Les archives du pape se prêtent merveilleusement à ça. En général, il y a 3 figures de personnes qui abordent de nouveaux continents, de nouvelles civilisations. Il y a les marchands, il y a les soldats et il y a les religieux. Et donc, les archives du pape sont pleines de témoignages de première main, très précoces, sur des contacts avec de nouvelles populations. Et donc, je pense que ce sont des archives qui aujourd'hui encore, et peut-être plus encore qu'hier, sont très désirables.
Thank you for your very interesting lecture. I have a question. How do you think about the change of
we talked about with Péter Pázmány yesterday of this change of name. For us, we were habituated to the old name, Secret Archives. I think it's I don't know. It's like a spirit of the era. It doesn't change anything to the consultation. In fact, it is so easy or difficult to access to the archives. I think it's a combination of a comparison with the Biblioteca Vaticana, Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, Archivio Apostolico Vaticano. I think that's all. I think, like an historian, it's a pity to change an old name because perhaps it was not understood by our contemporaries, but all the historians that work in this archive know very well that secret, it's separate, domestic or private archives, and that's all. So it's more an obligation to the society in the world as an obligation to the historians. Well, that's, the archives don't change. That's
Thank you very much.
very more important.
Another question. Professor, I am really surprised that some French manuscripts were disappeared because in the history of the French research in Vatican, because the Hungarian had a lot of disappeared manuscripts for Hungarian historians, and we started our work with the publishing of these manuscripts. This is a very interesting experience of your lecture for me. The other is that you have a very great and very beautiful institutions in Rome and in France, but the personal initiations, how important this is surprising for me. And the most surprising thing is that Louis Duchess and Fraknói have born in the same year. In the same year, exactly in the same year, in 1443, and that he gives us the hope that also the Hungarian research in Vatican will be ahead. Not as yours, but later. Thank you for your lecture.